training on hipster racism, what kinds of things were you hoping to talk about, or what were you thinking? What might be some things we would talk about or address in this session?
Expectation,
Okay.
and I didn't know anything about the hipster part,
Yep.
so I
So,
certainly don't have any.
so you really keyed in on this idea of racism, just talking about racism and
Well,
diversity. And,
well, it was diversity,
yep.
and I don't know, there's probably a lot I can learn.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just learning
Cool. 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 So in but you obviously come to this conversation either with some questions or some things that you were thinking around this idea of diversity. So like what prompted, because others, colleagues, didn't to come and sit in like you have. So I'm trying to think about what drew you to this, at least having this conversation.
well, I think it could make me a better person.
Okay.
Um, and definitions, you know, um, first off, the definition of diversity,
Yep.
because I've been asked about diversity
Yep.
at interviews.
Yep.
And to me, diversity means many things. It's
Yep.
not being black and white. It's not, well, it's not race versus whatever. There's so many things to consider, and I didn't understand what you could tell me about that.
Yep.
And I wasn't planning on getting started the first
Oh yeah.
classes,
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
guess I was just ready to observe.
Okay. Well, I have tons of stuff for you to absorb, and we'll start off with that first question, right? So how is it that diversity gets defined, or what is the definition of diversity? And I would say, like you, that there are. I would agree with you. There are a number of ways in which we could define it. I think the important thing in recognizing how and we define it is to ask ourselves, for what purpose is the definition, right? So not only how am I defining it, but why do I want it defined? Because then that allows us to come up with something that we can all understand. So here's an example of a definition that leads to a particular kind of viewpoint and mindset, right? So I'm going to put this up on the board. So when you look at those shapes, what do you see? You see triangles, square, all right? What else do you see? Uh-huh. Some of them are shaded in different ways, colored in different ways. What else do you see? You see a circle in a square, right? Yep. Yep. What else? So all the triangles are lined up, all right? And if I was a better craftsman, they would all be the same size, right? If I had paid a little more attention, I could have made them all the same size. But in fact, they're not, right? But they're roughly, they're roughly similar in a number of ways, right?
I
So
was assuming that they were the same.
Yep, and that was a safe assumption to make. I tried my best, right? Or I didn't try my best, but I did it quickly. So you made the assumption that they were the same. So you obviously see some similarities between those. And again, what makes those things similar?
What makes
All of them similar. They're all graphic images, and they're all shapes, right? They're geometric shapes, right? So those are, yeah. So they're all of those are geometric shapes. Are they also different? In fact, they are, right? So although they have a lot of commonalities between them, they simultaneously have a lot of differences. So diversity, and again, the purpose by which you want to define something is important in the definition that you come up with, right? So for me, diversity is understanding our differences and commonalities at the same time. Why might looking at diversity using that frame of reference be important to an educator or an educational system?
Well, this is where it brings you,
Yeah.
because we're all different, but we all have something.
Yeah, we all are different and we all have we have things in common, right? And so part of talking about particularly diversity in this kind of way in an educational institution like Rasmussen College, or I teach at Bethel University, it becomes important because the truth is with both of those things, right? So students come because of both commonalities and differences. And sometimes their differences, no, so we create opportunities to use both those commonalities and differences for students to achieve their potential. Because oftentimes, one of those has hindered them in some kind of way. And so as an educational institution, it becomes important for us to know that these things exist so that we can get students what they need to be successful in their own lives. So related to this kind of concept of diversity is, so there's three parts of what I do out in the world. So the diversity is one part. Then there's this part called equity. Have you heard that word before? Ever used it in kind of an educational setting or whatnot? Have you heard equity? Okay. What word does that look similar to? Equal, equality, right? So I was always taught that that we want equality in lots of things, and so what we found, like with my sisters in the movement, in the feminist movement, really looking for equality, right? So I want to get paid the same amount for the same job, so forth and so on, blah, blah, blah. Well, when we start talking about educational systems and we talk about how people interact with each other, equality sometimes comes up short. And equity is the next step to help people what they need to be successful in their own lives, right? So an example that I like to use for that is the CHS Stadium. Have you ever been there to the St. Paul Saints Stadium? Okay. So have you ever been to one of those big sports stadiums like the Excel Center
We could compare it to the US Bank.
or the US Bank Stadium, right? So you've been there? I haven't been there yet. I mean, it's massive. Is it glorious?
Inside it is, I
It
think the
is?
city is on the outside.
Oh, really? Okay, so the inside, it looks much better than the outside.
The inside is beautiful.
It's just beautiful. All right. So, what sporting event have you been there, or what event was it that you were there?
It was just the opening.
It was just the opening.
I didn't
Okay.
do anything.
Okay, cool. But you've been to some kind of sporting outing or event in one of these big places, right? Coliseums.
Okay,
Kind
I
of
did
the-
the Target.
Okay, so the Target Field. Okay, that's great. Target Field. So what happens at halftime or during an intermission in those kinds of sporting events? What kind of two things? There are two things that typically happen during that break time. What are those things that happen? So the guys go off the field, and as spectators, what do? We go to the bathroom, and then some people say, we go get beer, right? So people go off and they get their concessions, and then other people are using the bathrooms. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but the line for the bathroom for women seems to be much different than the line for men using the bathroom. What have you noticed in the difference of those lines?
The difference is that they seem to want to build the bathrooms the same size.
Mm-hmm.
From the women's section.
So the women's lines are backed up forever, and men seem to just go in and out, right? They pop in, pop out, blah, blah, blah. That is equality. One men's restroom, one women's restroom. Equality. But in practicality, although it is equal, it's not serving everyone the way it could. So the CHS Stadium took into account that particular phenomenon. And so when we talk about equality, we typically talk about fairness, that things are going to be fair, right? Which I think is interesting because my parents had some particular worldviews about fairness. What did your parents tell you about fairness? But what if you get a pencil and I get a pen? Ah, why? Because what's at the root of that question? Why did he get that and I got this? Or why did he get this and I got that? What's at the root of that question? This idea of fairness. And I don't know about your parents, but my parents told me life is not fair. That's what my parents told me. They said sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but life isn't fair. And so the expectation that life is fair is a false expectation as far as I was raised, right? So here's the interesting thing, that when we talk about equality, we talk about fairness. We want everything to be fair. But there are those thought processes that say that maybe life's not fair and you just kind of get what you get. So on top of that, when we talk about this idea of equity, CHS Stadium understood this phenomenon of the bathrooms. So one of the things that they did that changed the game for them, for their stadium, is that for every one men's bathroom, there are two women's bathrooms.
I say that's the way to go.
You would say that's the way to go. But that is unfair. Equity, right?
Yes, because it's unfair to you.
Ah, so no one ever asked, is it unfair when there's just one restroom for men and one restroom for women? No one ever asks, is it unfair to women to have to wait in that line, right? So this idea of equity is really about giving people what they need to be successful. So even when I taught high school, I taught here, I teach at Bethel currently, and one of the things that I was always conscious of was the fact that I may have students that come in at the same time, but they may in fact need different things. And so sometimes I had to set up independent studies in my class because I had students that were so advanced. Other times I had in the same classroom students that were so behind that I had to figure out how to give them supplemental things to get them caught up with the main part of the bell curve, if you will, in my classroom. Looking at how I treated my students, one might suggest that I was treating them unfairly. However, what I needed was to get the same outcome from my students, which meant that I may have to use different methods for each of them. And so when we talk about this idea of equity, equity really is this concept that these differences and these commonalities require different kinds of things to be successful. And so, equity. And then the last concept is this concept of inclusion, that we're trying to figure out how to include people given their commonalities and their differences, the fact that they need equity, that there are certain different things that they need to be successful, and how do we eliminate any barriers to their success? And so inclusion is the third leg of the work that I do. So, another way to think about equity and inclusion is this concept that, did you have siblings growing up? Lots of siblings or a couple of siblings? 3 siblings, all right. Yeah, and where did you fall in that set of, you're number 2? Okay, cool. So I'm number 1 in my family. Yes, so that becomes the story, right? So it was funny, so there's 4 of us in our family. Sometimes there were 6 because my parents would foster kids. And when it came time to get things, we did not all get the same thing. We got what we needed. And so equity really is helping get what they need, even if it's not the same thing. So when my brother got shoes, because I didn't need them, right? But when there was a time when we all needed something, we got what we needed as opposed to necessarily what we wanted or what we, I thank God I didn't get what I deserved, right? So, and inclusion is lowering any barriers to allowing people to do those other 2 things. So, that's an important premise. And I think your question around defining diversity is an important discussion to start having. Because if we don't know what we're talking about, we'll be off on all sorts of tangents and misunderstandings, even though we may be using the same words. And so I think that's an important piece to kind of talk about. Some other things, so if you open up your handout, that I think are important to address is that all human beings are searching for very similar things. I mean, we demonstrated it in the shapes here, that there are differences and commonalities. And so our commonalities are some of these universal values that human beings have. And universally, we're looking for significance, we're looking for belonging, and we're looking for safety. You'll find that that top graphic, that we're looking for significance, belonging, and safety. And significance simply says that I am a person with purpose and power. I was born with gifts and talents. I can do something, right? My birth was not an accident. I'm here on assignment to do something. And whether that something is something that, the God or the gods tell me this is my purpose, or I define what my purpose is, that those are the things that give us significance, right? So having purpose and power. We're all seeking belonging. We want to be in relationships with other human beings who recognize our purpose and our power. I would imagine that your friends, your network of friends, understand your purpose and power, even when your family doesn't.
I think sometimes other people recognize it more than we do.
Yeah, oftentimes they do. Which is why it's important to have other people to demonstrate those things to you, right? To reflect them back to you. And then lastly, we're all looking for safety. We're looking for physical, mental, emotional, spiritual safety to be in relationships with people who understand our significance. Right? So we're all striving for significance, belonging, and safety. And how we get that significance, belonging, and safety is very different from person to person and from culture to culture. And so to say that this will work for all people or, all groups is to miss the point that we have these commonalities and these differences. And so it also becomes important. So the commonalities we just talked about is that ultimately the significance, belonging, and safety. But the difference is that we also have sometimes can be seen as obstacle illusions. Obstacle illusions. Not optical illusions, but obstacle illusions. And obstacle illusions are these artificial barriers to authentic human relations. So I can't, I don't understand those people's culture, so I can't serve them effectively until I know their culture. Well, you know what? You may never know their culture, but you still can effectively interact with them, right? Those people are of a different racial group, or they have a different way of thinking or doing things, so I can't interact with them. That's not totally true. You can, if you recognize those commonalities. I've never been in a war-torn country, but I have been hungry. Not quite starving, but I have been hungry. I have had my heart broken. I've also broken hearts. I know what it is to yearn for something. I know what it is to be in relationships with people. I know what it means to have someone die. I know what it means to have new life birth into a family, right? All of those are things that have nothing, all those are things that come out of our commonalities of being what? Human. And too often we forget about our humanity. We go off into our little cliques or sects and say, I'm of this group. As if that removes us from our humanity. And so It's important to remember that we've been, oftentimes, tricknology has been used to make us forget about our humanity in an effort to allow us to forget about other people's humanity. So, and it's really interesting, there's been lots of conversations about building a wall between, the United States and Mexico to keep those people out. And people are really up in arms about that. Really disturbed by that. And I find it interesting that there's conversations about building a physical wall, but there's always been a wall. It just hasn't been physical. We've always been patrolling that area to keep the others out with an ideology, with other resources, but there's never been a physical wall. So, oftentimes, if we're not mindful, we can get sucked into other tricks. But the conversation we should be having is about the walls we currently have. How do we dismantle those, or what do we do with those to create a society that we think is important? And to cut to the chase, how do we get to all of this stuff? How do we help with diversity, equity, and inclusion? We really need to spend some time thinking about the dignity and honor of being human. So, having the opportunity to be educated is a huge responsibility, because we change the nature of generations. So sometimes folks like us, we get so caught into I don't know if you've been around a farm or agriculture, and when they've had working horses, right? So they put the blinders on the working horses so that they're not distracted by all these other things, and they can stay focused on the work. And sometimes folks like us, we get like that too, right? So our task is to do this thing and blah, blah, blah. But sometimes we forget that when I'm not just helping the person that's in front of me. So, quick story to kind of accentuate this point. I was at a grocery store. No, it wasn't a grocery store. It was the dollar store. And there was a young man, a young lady, and a small child in a stroller. And a number of things kind of precipitated my engagement with these folks. But he looks at her in the store and he says, "You stupid boop. Why the boop are you making this decision?" Blah, blah, blah. So he's cussing her out in the store. And the store is full of people. And what do the people in the store say to themselves as this is going on? Can't believe he's yelling at her, and what? And he's swearing in front of the kid. And so what decisions do they make about what's happening in that little family? What do you think they say to themselves? Yeah, it's their thing. It's none of my business. I'm gonna let that go. However, I said the same thing to myself. It's none of my business what's going on over there. And why do you think people say that? Why do you think they say that's none of my business? Because it's not? Uh-huh. Have you ever been embarrassed by, particularly this happens, no, I guess kids do it to each other too. Have you ever been embarrassed by someone else? Like they purposely embarrassed you? Yeah. What kinds of feelings come up when you've been purposefully embarrassed? You feel bad. What else do you feel? You feel bad about yourself. What else? Yep. So you wonder what you did wrong, right? You feel embarrassed. self-adequacy starts popping up, right? And in some cases, I have felt resentment towards that person, sometimes even anger towards that person. Um, but I wonder, when physical violence happens, what is the emotional residue of a physical violent act?
Other person causing the act.
Act is acted upon, the recipient of the violence.
I'm gonna say that they still say, what did I do?
They will say, what did I do wrong? They may have resentment. They may be embarrassed. Wait a minute. So embarrassing someone and hitting someone in a number of ways are very similar. So disrespecting someone technically could be considered an act of violence. That's interesting. So if someone said, if he had hit her, I would have said something. They're not telling the truth. You know why? If verbal violence is in fact violence, and they didn't say anything, had the physical gone down, I'm not guaranteed that they actually would have done something then either.
Yeah, but I'm still gonna back up there.
Please.
I still don't believe that we interfere. I mean, I didn't interfere. I was suggesting that we should.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that we should or we should not. What I am suggesting, though, let me finish the story. So the couple, so he engages on that, and I am one of those individuals. I don't interfere in stuff like that typically, but I'm compelled to say something. So I make a deal with myself. I say, self, if they're still outside by the time I'm done taking care of my stuff, then I'll say something to them, right? So I take my time, hoping that they've gone. I go outside and they're not. So I'm not asking you to do what I've done, but I am asking you to think about this principle and apply it in whatever way applies to your own life, right? So long story short, I follow them into a grocery store, have enough sense to not just tap a stranger on the back and say, I want to talk to you, right? So I walk around to meet them, and my courage is now waning because now that I'm closer to this dude, he's a little bigger than I thought he was, right? And I'm also nervous because if I say the wrong thing, what might happen?
Reaction.
Yeah. What do you think might happen if I say the wrong thing?
Oh, I think he's gonna get even angry, and he's gonna take it out on her.
He's going to take it out on her. So I'm asking myself, I'm like, am I really supposed to be doing this? And myself says, yes, you're supposed to be doing this. I'm like, do I have the courage to do this? Yes, you have the courage to do it. I said, okay, then the part of me that's compelling me to do this, you better step up your game, right? So I'm standing in front of this guy, and I asked him to take a step to the left, just to give the clue for the mom and the baby to give us some space, so we create this kind of private public space. And I say to the guy, can you take a step? And he's like, for what? And I'm like, I try to show it as nicely as I can that I mean him no harm, right? Excuse me. So I said, no, sir, it's all good. It's all good. I just want to talk to you for a second. So he takes a step, and so we have this moment in time together. And I don't know what I'm going to say, but the universe tells me to open my mouth. So I open my mouth. And when I open my mouth, this is what comes out. Sir, can I teach you something that I've learned about women? If you want her to grow, you have to water her and give her sunshine. I repeated that because I didn't know what that meant, right? So I repeated it to the young man, and he looks at me and he goes, I said, sir, do you know what I mean? And he says, yeah, I do know what you mean. I said, have a good day, sir. I'm going about my way. I didn't try to get his number or anything like that. And it took me a long time to figure out how, or why I was compelled to speak. And when it came to me, I realized something about people like us in this kind of field, is that sometimes we forget that when we step in to help someone that's in front of us, that we're also helping all of the people that they are responsible for. So we change generations by helping and allowing students to be successful through their education process. My parents raised me on, I was in Head Start. I don't know if you know what Head Start is or have heard of it. And they were sophomores in college when they got married, which meant it took a little longer to get through school, and life started happening, and my other brothers and sisters started coming as well. So it delayed that stuff. So we found ourselves in poverty. And so my parents put me and my brother in Head Start. I have a daughter. She's Head Start age. Guess where she doesn't have to go? To Head Start. Why? Because my parents, I have nothing against Head Start. I'm not saying that I don't know what my life would be like without it. But I'm also glad that I was able to acquire the tools that my daughter won't have to go there for the same reasons I went there. And if we could qualify, I might send her there because it was such a good program. So even in that, so I'm not asking you to interrupt things that are dangerous or whatnot, but I am asking you to recognize that when we do help people, it's not just the person that's in front of us that we're helping. It's all those people behind. Right? Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
And I do that in my work.
Yes.
I'm not going to do that in the shopping.
You may not, but you also may find that there are times that things will challenge you in such a way that you go, I can't be silent in that. I can't let this pass.
Okay, that may occur,
No. I'm not walking around looking for stuff, right? I'm not looking for, to pick whatever or to chastise people based. But there's certain things that when you see them and they happen, you go. And it's so funny. You'll know when it's time to do that because you'll say to yourself, somebody has to do something about this, whatever it is. And guess who the somebody is? It's you, right? And so whatever in your sphere of influence, and it's funny because I don't know if, actually I should put it up on the board. The 2016 election map of Minnesota was a very interesting map to me. You have to see it. So I'll just draw it up.
Oh, good. Well
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. So, roughly.
You forgot the look.
Which one? Over here?
Lower,
Lower?
lower.
What is it?
Right.
I mean, roughly speaking, right? Very roughly speaking. So this area right here, and this area right here, and I think this area as well.
That like the illusion.
Yeah, give or take. And this would be Twin Cities. This is Rochester, roughly. Those were blue. Everything else red. When I first looked at that, I was like, I know exactly what that is. That's Democrats and Republicans. Look at that. It's just playing out right there on the map. However, upon closer examination, I saw something more profound than just that. What do you notice about those areas? What do you know about those areas? That they're so-called metropolitan areas, right? Meaning what? Highly educated, right? Lots of diversity, so to speak, right? And places in citadels of civility, what it means to be kind of refined, in those places, more or less, right? I mean, at least by Minnesotan standards. You also find that in those same places, they're not having a lot of conversations with Greater Minnesota. They're telling Greater Minnesota, be like us. But they're not having conversations with Greater Minnesota about what Greater Minnesota's needs are. There are 87 counties in Minnesota. How many do you think make up the metro? 7. Which means which now means the power lie in the state.
Right here.
So if these places aren't about important stuff, then this explains the 2016 election very clearly. Yeah. So the so-called 7-county metro, or even if we add those other, still doesn't make up the vast number of folks in Minnesota. And so it becomes important for us to reach out and have those conversations, or we will constantly be polarized. And this idea of polarization basically is we will never be able to see another person's point of view because we're so locked into our own point of view. So there's that. So polarization. We're not having conversations across these so-called lines, which is why this definition of diversity becomes important. That I can recognize that we have differences and commonalities, because then I can talk across these so-called lines and not have polarized lenses, not see the world from one point of view. That's one of the biggest problems, like with the world today, is that there's not a whole lot of critical thinking happening, and you can find any news source to support what you already think. Right? So the folks who exclusively watch Fox News, polarized. The people who exclusively watch MSNBC, polarized. Right? In my own practice, I watch both. I try to get as much information from both sides, because what I know is that somewhere in the middle is the truth, right? But that's not what is encouraged. We don't typically get encouraged to do those things. You'll hear conversations like this. Black Lives Matter. Ever heard that? Yeah. And then there are other people who say, all lives matter. And then there's even a third group that says, blue lives matter. And typically when they talk about blue lives, they're not talking about Martians. They're talking about, cops, right? So All three of those are interesting. Those are interesting because I believe Black lives do matter. I believe all lives matter too. You know what? Blue lives also matter. So here's the thing. Why do I have to choose? They can all be true simultaneously. I don't have to make a choice between one or the other because they can all be true at the same time. I have officer friends. I don't want them hurt. I don't want their families to be sad. I don't want bad things to happen to them. I have black friends. I don't want bad things to happen to my black friends. I have friends from other groups. I don't want bad things to happen to them either. So this false choice that we oftentimes have to make continues to divide and pit us against one another when, again, it's a false choice. I don't have to make those kinds of choices. They can all be true simultaneously.
I'm still confused
Yep,
about, because people do make choices.
yep.
So, to me, and you can argue with me.
I'm not going to argue with you.
It's clearly in the middle, always. So, I agree with that.
And we won't have any disagreement. We don't have any disagreement.
But I still don't understand how there has to be this group, this group, this group.
Yeah.
That can be true.
That's a great question. But I think you know ultimately the response to that part of it, right? Or at least you partly know the response innately. Because what do we know about people who all get along?
No, a lot of people at all get along.
Right? But what if they did? What would happen if people actually started getting along?
Kind of peaceful.
Be kind of peaceful. Peace doesn't make a whole lot of money. Chaos, disorder, fear, those things certainly generate funds, don't they? So there's that. I didn't want to go too far off on that tangent, but I did want to kind of talk about that. So when we talk about this idea of racism, right, we have to also define race before we even get to racism. So how would you, or what have you been taught, or what have you heard about race? What is a race?
Well, since more, give it up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I would have said it's a group of people from common background.
Yeah, no, that's fair, right? But now, what would you say?
Well, now I don't know what to say.
Ah. So, you've seen a Ford F-150? Big truck. I think I saw, it must have been a diesel. I saw a Ford 350. Something was ginormous. I was like, is that a semi or a tank? Right. Ford F-150. So if I buy a Ford F-150 and I drive it to Virginia, Minnesota, what is it? Is it still a Ford F-150? Yeah. So if I drive it up to International Falls, Ford F-150. If I drive it up to Ontario, no, what's right above us? Is it out, Toronto? No. What's right above us? Doesn't matter. So let's say I drive it over to Ontario, which is over on the Michigan side, right? So go east Ontario, drive it there. What is it? F-150. Take a ferry over to Iceland. I'm in Iceland. What is it? Ford F-150. Take it over to Finland. Drive through Sweden. Take a ferry over to Denmark. Drive on down to France. Hop a ferry over to Morocco. Go to Morocco. Go to Libya. Drive through Libya, all the way down through the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all the way down to South Africa. What is my car? It's a Ford F-150. Jump over to Madagascar, right? Take a ferry to Madagascar, take that ferry all the way over to Australia. Yeah? Drive it through Australia, drive it back, take some ferries through New Zealand, go back through Southeast Asia, drive it up through Russia, go across the Bering Straits through Alaska, all the way back down into the United States, through Washington, Seattle, Oregon, Montana, and drive it right back to Minnesota. No matter where that car is on the planet, it is a Ford F-150. Why? It was built that way, right? It was born that way. It is what it is, no matter where it is on the planet. When we talk about this concept of race, that's not true. So racial groups change from nation state to nation state. Did you know that there are no Hispanics in Mexico? No Hispanics in Mexico. Why? In Mexico, they're called Mexicans. That's not what they call what they're called. Did you know that you can be white in Spain and Hispanic in the United States? Did you know that Sicily is closer to Africa than it is to Europe?
I'm looking at my map. No, I would not have guessed that.
Right? We'll look at some definitions of, no, we'll do that right now. Let's look at these definitions of race. So I was the affirmative action officer for Anoka County. And so I had the responsibility of cataloging people's races for these federal reports that we have. So So this comes directly from the federal government. Yeah, I just muted it. I was just trying to, oh, there it is. Oh, hold this down. Flashing and swirling. So I had to do these reports for the federal government. Now, I want you to pay attention to these. I'll grab them. So before we look at this, What do you think is the determination of race? So where does the definitions or these concepts of race come from? Where do you think they come from?
I have no idea where they come from. I only know that on forms they say, are you black, are you Hispanic,
Yep.
are you multi, are you,
Yeah. Right? So you just know that they do, right? So before you were aware of these forms, were you aware of this concept of race? So where did you get your awareness from? Where'd that come from?
I mean, I don't know that I do it with race. People are different.
You knew that people are different, but at some point you were able to make the distinction and put together that this person is a different race than you. So where do you think where did you get that? Do you think you were born with that?
Probably.
Probably not, right? So it's something you probably learned, right? Now here's the interesting thing. So oftentimes we think that science tells us what these things are. Oftentimes. What makes up a race, or what makes one race of people different than another race, is typically things that we think we observe. We think we observe these things, right? Like you and I, we think that our skin may be different. And what gives that illusion of difference?
Visual.
So visual, all right? So what's visually different about our skin? Color. So I'm brown, and you happen to not be brown, right? Sometimes we'll look at the shapes of our nose, or the kinkiness or the curliness of our hair, and we actually believe that that has something to do with these differences, right? So, so I want you to read this with me. We'll look at this together. So this is the federal government of the United States of America has this, and you see this on the forums all the time, right? In the work that you do. So race and ethnic identification. Let's see if I can make this bigger. I'm over 40, so I like kind of stuff big. No. Oh, go back. All right, I think it's bigger. So here we go. Self-identification is the preferred method of identifying race and ethnicity information necessary for the EEO-1 report, right? So this says self-identification is preferred method, which suggests what? If it's the preferred method, it also suggests that you can make a choice, that there may be another method, right? So the preferred method is for self-identification. Employers are required to attempt to allow employees. Hold on. Employers are encouraged to attempt to allow. That's not the same as mandating the allowance or mandating that it happens, right? So very wishy-washy kind of language here. So employers are required to attempt to allow employees to use self-identification to complete the EEO-1 report, period. If an employee declines to self-identify, employment records or observer identification may be used. So if a person doesn't fill out their form on their FAFSA, their ethnic or racial group, what? You can pick it for them. What is this? This is not a theory.
Well, no, it is in theory on the FAFSA because I don't touch it.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So in theory, I'm a FAFSA, right? Yeah. So in this EEO-1 report, one of the things that I would do, so employees would say, I'm not going to put my race rate. I'm opting out because it says it's an option on the form. Yes, it's optional for them, for us to allow them to attempt to do it. But ultimately, somebody's going to do it, and it's me. So at my particular job, I was the person who did this. So that's interesting. First
So
of all.
if it says optional, and this is getting off.
Yep, nope, it's right on topic.
If it says optional, why do you have to, why did you have to put it outside? Why did you have to do that?
Because the report from the federal government said I had to. I'm required to attempt to allow them to do it themselves. So what's the other part of that? I'm required to attempt to allow them to do it. If they don't do it, what? I have to do it. Just like I'm required to attempt them to do it. Which also means if they don't do it, I'm required to do it. So that's the first part that I think is very interesting. The second part is race and ethnic designations as used by the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, which is a branch of what? Government, particularly the U.S. federal government, right? So, do you think this is a rogue entity in the government? No, it's not a rogue entity. Right? It is following all the mandates that other federal institutions also are following as well. Right? So they're not rogue. They didn't just make up their own stuff to do this stuff. So here's the most interesting thing about that. Race and ethnicity designations as used by the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission do not denote scientific definitions of anthropological origins. Do not denote scientific definitions. Wait a minute. What are they saying just in that sentence?
Well, I think earlier you said science.
That's what we like to think, right? That's what we oftentimes have been taught. But what is the federal government saying in this sentence? Now, this is under the race and ethnicity identification. What are they saying? No, they're not kind of saying it. They are saying it, right? They're saying this is what we're about to tell you is not based on science. Which means if it's not based on science, we in fact made them up, right? So when we talk about this idea of race, we have Hispanic or race or ethnic identification. I think Hispanic or Latino falls into this category of ethnic identification. A person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture, regardless of race. So I could be Hispanic or Latino, regardless of my race. You've seen this before, I'm sure. Right? White, not Hispanic or Latino. Right? So white, which is not this. A person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa.
I've never read that.
So white people are from North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. So a person who's Iranian is white. A person from Morocco, white. An Egyptian, white. Have you ever heard that before?
I've never read that whole one, that was defined with the I don't read it.
Guess what it doesn't say? Caucasian.
Well, but there's a complication underneath, you know.
We'll look them up. No, they're not the same. Okay, we'll get to that, right? So black or African American who is not Hispanic or Latino. A person having origins of any of the black racial groups of Africa. Ah, right? Now the other thing that I find problem with this is that my English teacher told me when I was a little kid, I was in 5th grade, Mrs. Young said, Andre, when you define the word, do not use the word in the definition. What have they done in this definition? They've used the word that they're trying to define in the definition that's supposed to be defining the word. Which actually leads us to what? No additional new information. Right? A whole confused state. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander who is not Hispanic or Latino, a person have origins in any of the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. Asian, not Hispanic or Latino, a person having origins of any of the original people of the Far East, which is Southeast Asia or the Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. Do you know or have you ever met people from any of these countries? Do they look anything alike? Do Asians look like Koreans? No, I'm sorry. Do Indians look like Koreans? No, they don't. Do people from Vietnam look like people from Cambodia? Yeah, the point being that we have all of these different kinds of people who, what lumps them into this one category? And white is from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. What are Russians? Where are Russians? They're from the Ukraine. What am I? You don't quite fit. So are you Asian? My point being, this concept, here, let me add one more thing. To complicate this further. Our closest neighbor, Canada. This is how Canada does the same thing we do. Where we talk about our so-called racial groups, they do theirs by country. So these are the 135 actually 132 different countries that Canadians come from. So they do theirs by race. Let's look at another Western country. Here we go. I think this is interesting. So in Armenia, they have a racial category called American, well, Armenian. And then Russians, the Kurds. In Australia, 92% Caucasian, 7% Asian, and Aboriginal is 1.5%. Bangladesh is the Bengali, the Arabal groups, and the non-Bengali Muslims. Right? So they all categorize their people in different ways. So when we talk about this idea of race, what are we actually talking about? And the trick, if there is one, is that race changes depending on your government. Your government defines what race is, because it's how they choose to organize their people. And so, for example, do you think they have, as a large category of folks, American Indians in South Africa? Probably don't. Why? Because they don't have a solid population of American Indians in South Africa. Right? So when we talk about this idea of race, that's what we have to recognize, is that race is a political construct. It's made up by governments for political purposes to somewhat divide and conquer people. Does that make sense? Sort of. It's a big concept to really try to bite off and understand that this is not race. Race is what the government has said it is. For example, if I was in Barbados, I would be a different race. Yeah. No, it's one of the biggest concepts that my students have the hardest time with, is this idea of race, because we've been told, or we think we've been told, exactly what it is, and that our world is oftentimes shaped around what we think we know what it is. So there's that. Yeah, so let's go back to your handout. So part of the problem with this idea of the hipster racists is that they believe that we are in a post-racial society, meaning that race does not play any significant political or social role in our society, that we no longer have to be concerned with or have conversations about this concept of race. So hipster racism was a term coined around 2006 in an article by Carmen Van Kerkhove. It's described and used as the irony or satire to mask racism. It is used to blatantly, it is the use of blatantly racist comments in an attempt to be controversial, edgy. Its irony is established in somewhat the post-racial belief that blatant expressions of genuine racism are no longer taken seriously and are outdated ways of thinking, thereby making the use of such overt expressions satiric. In some cases, hipster racism can be seen as the appropriation of cultural artifacts by hipsters, right? So using cultural artifacts to make fun of stuff by saying I can make fun of things that aren't traditionally funny. So if you open up your handout, you'll also notice on the right-hand side at the top, too hip to be aware, under that are some pictures of people who are misappropriating cultural artifacts. So to understand this idea of misappropriation, we have to get an understanding of what culture is. So we said before that I'll talk about this idea of critical race theory in just a minute. So this is what I call the culture carrot, and you'll see it right at the bottom, right? So there are two parts to this carrot. What's the top? What would you call the top part? Okay, the leafy part, right? So we'll call that the leafy part, and we'll call this the root, right? So how about I'll call this the greens. And we'll call this the root. Now, each one of these parts has a particular duty, and they need to do that duty for the whole to be successful, right? So what does the greens, or the top part, do for the root?
I'm gonna guess.
Yep, and you're going to be right.
Everything is sunlight to make it grow.
Yes, it brings in the sunlight, turns that sunlight into energy that can be stored in the bottom, right? Now, what does the bottom, the roots, do for the greens?
That's more complicated. I'm not sure.
Oh, you're pretty sure.
Oh, that's right.
So first of all, what does the whole thing need to survive? So where's this green part getting this energy from?
Well, I said the sun.
Yep, from the sun. What else is coming from the sky and the atmosphere that this thing needs to live?
I'm sorry?
What else is coming from the atmosphere?
Well, are you talking about the chlorophyll?
So the chlorophyll gets stored down here. And what does this take in that the top needs?
Well, the nutrients from the soil.
Nutrients from the soil and also water, right? So it takes in nutrients from the soil and the water and it feeds it to the top. So they need each other to survive. Okay? So let's call the root of culture values. Okay? And we're going to call the greens of culture artifacts. So values and artifacts are related to each other. They need each other. Artifacts are all the things that you can see about a culture that demonstrates how one culture is different from another. Right? So what are some things you can see about culture? So you go to a Mexican restaurant versus a Chinese restaurant. How do you know the difference between the two? Okay, so decorations. What else? Menu.
I'd say that nobody
Right? Yeah, the way they dress. Music is different. We're looking at it culturally, then if music is different, dance is certainly different. So all of these are, and there are lots of other things, right? That we can see about the culture. So these would be called cultural artifacts. All of these things are cultural artifacts. But then there are deep-rooted things that we don't necessarily know unless we're part of the culture, right? And so what might be some of those things that we might not know unless we're part of the culture? Yeah, religion. So religion, God, no God. What else? Yeah. Think of your own.
Their values.
Yep, so their values. That's okay, we can start there. So what are some of those values that are in your culture?
Well,
Yeah, you know tons. You made it this far.
well,
So what is your culture? You're white?
I don't really, I'm of Swedish heritage.
You're of Swedish heritage, okay?
I haven't,
You don't do anything Swedish? Nothing? No desserts around Christmas time?
okay.
No. Oh.
Put this fix up at the front.
Yep, but we'll start there. So what kinds of stuff are you doing at Christmas time?
I'm trying to think of what it's called.
Is it called Krim Kaka?
No.
Is it
Well, although that's.
Lefse?
Lefse.
Lefse? Lutefisk?
Oh,
Ish? Oh, ish. Wait a minute, you said ish. That's not German. Ish isn't German. That's Swedish, right? All that stuff.
Language.
Right, so language. So we got language up here, but here's the funny thing. People can say ufta and not know what it means. Right? So we have language up here, we have language down here. We have worldview. We can have the meaning of beauty. Life, death, what those things mean. The use of time, all of that stuff, right? Ceremonies, all of that stuff. Yeah. Family, who is family, who's not family, blah, blah, blah. Well, why do you guys have lutefisk still?
I have no idea. That stuff's poison.
There's poison, there's nasty, but just somebody seems to have it, right?
My dad, right?
I will tell you that it's directly related to these two things. Right? So when we talk about this idea of culture, this is culture. It is the artifacts and it is the values. It's the relationship between those two things. So when I see an artifact, so when you see lefse, and you know your dad loved it, and there's a reason your dad loved it. You see that artifact, it reminds you of the entire culture, right? And I would imagine that someone still has it for the same reason that your dad loved it, or loves it, right? So that's important. So what happens if somebody takes your artifacts and says, you know what, we're gonna take lefse and we're just gonna put it on pizza. Does that seem weird? Yes, why?
Well, practical, we have two breads.
Yep, so you had two breads. What else? What about lutefisk? Listen, you know what? We're gonna start putting Rufus on pizza. Nobody would eat it because it's disgusting, right? Apparently to you, right? So, or what if somebody said, you know what? Um, we're gonna take lefse, and lefse is just a Swedish pizza bread. It's Swedish pizza bread, and we're gonna make pizzas out of the Swedish pizza bread. What do you say to that? Somebody said that.
Interesting. Might be good.
It might be good, but is lefse Swedish pizza bread? No, it's not. No, they would they be right in saying that? Would you feel the need to correct them if they said, you know what, this is traditional Swedish pizza bread, and you know that's what it's called? Why might you?
Well, because that's not what it's.
Because that's not what it's traditionally used for. That's not what it's called, right? So when other people try to define your artifacts without having any relationship to you, that's called misappropriation. That's cultural misappropriation. So if I said, you know what, this lefse actually is not, it's not traditional Swedish pizza bread. It's actually Swedish, used for Swedish hats. So they form them and they put these hats made out of this bread stuff, and that's what the Swedes do. What are you gonna say to that? You're nuts. What's wrong with you? You're totally misusing what we've deemed important, right? Or what culturally is sound. So when we misuse these artifacts, then that becomes cultural misappropriation. So people are really upset with the Washington football team, right? Because they've taken on a name that is an icon, and they've disconnected it from the values. And the same with, I think it's Cleveland's baseball team. They have those, right? And it's so interesting when the stuff gets flipped, people get really upset. Right? Let me just show you an example of that really quick. Yeah, here it is. I think I'm still on. I just muted it this time to pay attention. Right? So have you seen these? It's Chief Wahoo, and then someone turned them into Caucasian. Like, what would it be like if? Oh, it's the Caucasians. That's what somebody turned it into. That the guy on ESPN wore it, and people got really upset. They're like, that's blasphemy. But the same folks weren't as upset when it was a Native American person. So it's important to understand this idea of misappropriation. So sometimes the hipsters will take, or people who believe that we're in a post-racial society will take icons from other cultures and use them as if it's something fun to do. So if you look at your handout, you'll see examples of that where, I really dislike Halloween because Halloween now is the time when people can dress up as other people as if it is cool. And it's really sad, right? So we have I'm not sure which actress this is, but she's in blackface. So she's dressed up as a black person, and she's not black, so that's like really not cool. Um, and so there's a mantra that people who believe we're in a post-racial society try to use. And the mantra kind of goes like this, or the top seven things that they talk about is, I'm so witty. So they will, dress up as a Native American or as some kind of classic Mexican or black person, and with the thought, or even you'll have males who will cross-dress, around Halloween with exaggerated body parts, thinking that that is a new joke, when in fact those are just old bad jokes, right? So I think Milton was probably one stress on, and I don't know that that joke needs to happen anymore. As Flip Wilson did it. I don't know if you are old enough to remember Flip Wilson. Um, uh, it happened in Living Color in the '90s, and today it's Medea. The guy dressing up as a woman and whatnot. I think even Robin Williams got an Academy Award for Mrs. Doubtfire for that kind of thing, right? But those aren't real original jokes. Those are old hats. This idea of recreational slumming, and this is kind of where missionaryism comes in. So people will say, I will be a missionary in that country because those poor people need my attention. The problem is that it's at your convenience that you give your help, right? So kind of recreational slumming. The majestic power of the N-word, and so a lot of particular people who believe that we're in a post-racial society believe they can just use the N-word because it has no power. Or if we use the N-word, we take the sting out of that. And I don't buy that. I still think that words like that are hurtful, particularly because they don't evoke a mental state that is a positive mental state. If you just think of the word and then think of what images come up, it's typically not butterflies and rainbows and sunshine that comes up. And then people that are genuinely interested in another culture but don't want to suffer with that culture are sometimes talked about as these hipster races. So it's this concept that I can be interested academically, but I don't want to suffer with that culture to learn about it. It's very much like the difference between going on vacation in a country and taking all of the tours that the vacation place offers, and going on vacation in the country and staying with the people, eating what the common people eat, going where the common people go. It's very much those kinds of things. And then this self-abasing behavior. So a lot of people who fall into this post-racial society really downgrade their own racial identity to accentuate the other, which is gives a false sense of the reality, right? So, my culture is just so boring, but they're so interesting. So I need to put down my culture so that I can lift up theirs. And that typically isn't a healthy way to interact with the world, right? And then it was a joke. So sometimes people will say stuff and that is blatantly or maybe not so blatantly, but clearly racist or designed to hurt somebody else, and then they try to joke it off. And we can't let that happen. We have to call bad behavior for what it is. And then number 7 is that hipster racists will sometimes say, well, we've had a black president, so now it's time for a woman president, or it's time for a Mexican president, or it's time for, blah, blah, blah. not realizing that they're playing into kind of this racial hierarchy, um, that, um, yeah, so that's an important thing. And then, have you ever heard of the game Cards Against Humanity? So it's very much like apples to apples, but like the most twisted, hateful version of apples to apples. And so you have to play this game and whatnot. And what we recognize though is that games. So when wolf pups are growing up, they do a lot of playing. Have you ever seen like any kind of puppy, right? How are they playing? What do they do? They nip at each other. They run around. What else? They jump on each other. You may hear them bark, right? Right. In the canine family, in the wolf family, what are they actually doing? Yeah, they're learning how to be an adult. They're building relationships. So play is just the practice for adulthood, right? So if we play hateful games, what are we practicing? Hateful things, right? And another example that I like to use is what do pilots use before they get actually into an airplane to practice? What is the flight simulator, right? So they get into the flight simulator, and it's supposed to be like real life, right? So they practice so that when they get into a plane, the simulator it's very much like what has happened, right? And typically, I've been in a few simulators myself. I don't know, have you been in a simulator? Can you imagine?
Yeah, maybe at a fair.
Yeah. No, that counts. That counts, right? So when you're in the simulator at the fair or whatnot, what is it like? What was it like?
I'm not quite sure what you mean, but I mean,
You're pretending, right?
in a race car
Or yeah, or a race car or whatnot. And the ones that I have been in have been very digital. It feels like very much like a video game, almost, right? So I'm in this thing and it looks like a video game, and it occurred to me that video games are actually simulators. So through video games, I'm slowly being trained to do something. So for those first person shooter games, have you ever seen those where people are shooting? It's a simulator. They're simulating real life situations or situations that have some consequences had they happened in real life. And I'm like, oh. So we have to be mindful the games that we play, the things that we do, the things that we simulate in our minds, because they have real world consequences. They are training us to do something. That playing is practice for real world activities.
Okay, so this is a pretty scary concept, but are you agree that these people that play these multi-day like, war games with the start playing people or whatever, but they're actually training themselves to do those things?
I would suggest that the brain does not know the difference between a memory and an activity.
So that's a yes.
That's how I'll answer that. That the brain itself, the neurons and the chemicals, whether I'm doing something or whether I'm remembering doing it, doesn't know the difference.
Well, that's a pretty long experience.
It can be, yes.
Because think about the millions of kids, my nephew is 3, he plays these video games. read in
I'll let this answer the question for you.
because I've always said to myself, oh, those things can't really, when they grade like multiple school students or whatever, or, um, or those are video grading or whatever, I don't know, not for that.
I'll let this answer the question for you.
Well, I don't, take it serious, but,
Have we ever asked the question, why? I would suggest that this simulation piece plays a role in it.
but we don't have a graph that shows, so how long ago did these video games, the real live action type video games? I mean, we've always had those little shooter ones in arcades and things, but
It'll take me a minute to pull up something very,
I think there's lots of reasons that we could do that,
yeah.
the.
But here's one example, right? So just the general firearm, so, of Americans. But I also think that coupled with the insatiable appetite that we have for the simulation of that violence and blah, 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 blah. I think there is a statistic that suggests that the mass school shooters had live action firearm games in their arsenal as well as armed weapons, right? So is there a direct correlation you could make? Not sure, but I do think that those are important correlations to make. My point being, though, is that we have to be mindful of the relationships that we have, what we do, how we interact with folks. Are we lifting and lifting humanity, or are we trying to lower it to the lowest common denominator? I did comedy for a number of years, and as a part of that, we talked about this concept of the top of one's intelligence, operating to the top of one's intelligence. So it was easy for us to do comedy where cursing or lewdness would be the punchline, but it's a whole lot more difficult and a whole lot more funny when you're able to engage comedy in such a way that lewdness and the blue jokes is what we would call them, weren't the real punchlines of your stuff. And sometimes you weren't as funny as you could have been had you used, a blue line, so to speak. But we really worked to do to the top of our intelligence. So on the back page of your handout is a graphic that simply says that equality does not mean justice. And so equality means everybody getting the same thing, but equity means that people get what they need to accomplish their outcomes. And then lastly, this idea of a hostile work environment, that humor is designed for comics. They do it best. And so in our workplace, we can find fun in situations. We can laugh at particular situations, find humor in situations, but I would avoid this idea of telling jokes about people. I think we can tell jokes about things, but then that's a slippery slope as well. Because if you take for example, Ole and Lena joke, you separate that for a Jewish person, or a Polak, or a blonde, or whatever, or a black person, a Mexican person. All of a sudden, the joke that was funny before is sort of not as funny now when we do that. Understand that anytime offense is taken, it needs to be addressed, and so an offense is an offense. So people will say, "Well, I meant no offense." That's fine what you meant, but what happened was it was offensive, right? So you have to recognize that. And sometimes people, because of people's personalities, they'll say, "Well, that's just how Joe is," or "That's just how Sue is." Well, even if that is a part of their personality, they need to check themselves, because they open us up for liability, right? So even though that may be a character trait of theirs, we can't just accept that as we can't just accept that without recognizing that there's some liability that comes with them acting that kind of way, right? Whether it be flirtatious or aggressive or whatever. So that's important. Number 5, it's important for all of us in a workspace to say something when we see these things, because the rule of law suggests that if you see something, you have to say something. Particularly, I think many of us are mandated reporters for a number of different reasons and ways. And so those are some of the pieces that we talk about in terms of looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, and specifically around this idea of the hipster races, the person who thinks it's cool to be shocking in their presentation. The last thing I wanted to present to you is sort of the framework by which a lot of this stuff operates. There's an interview that I did with some guys who consider themselves to be hipsters, and this is where I got a lot of the pieces that I share with you today is through this and other interviews. But I'll send you a link to this, and you can watch it at your convenience. The other thing that I wanted to share with you is this idea of critical race theory, which is the framework of a number of the pieces that we do. Critical race theory. And critical race theory is the intersectionality of these 3 concepts. That race is prevalent in interwoven in all of American society, this idea of race. And that this idea of law determines race and enforces race. And that law also provides power to redefine race. Okay? So, and power is simply the ability to get things done. And in the United States, there are certain things that you need to have power. So these 3 concepts kind of revitalize and reinitialize themselves and create this perpetualness of a system called racism. Right? So race is this governmental thing that gets supported and infused by laws, and power is like the goods, jobs, services, and money that one needs in the society, but the laws and your race determine what pieces of the pie, if you will, you're able to get. So critical race theory is built on these 3 principles, which is what we've gone over in the time that we've had. So we've gone over um, those three pieces. Any additional questions you have? Was this enough? Was it too much? Was it more than what you were? Was it as much as you were hoping you were? Thinking?
Well, that's again, it is really
Okay.
but, I like what you said, is that really, doing that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, I really wish it was touching the picture.
Yeah. Cool. Good, good, cool. No, I'm just,
We could be here all day and I'd still be.
yeah, well, this, you know, and to be quite fair, this is a springboard for you, right? So from here on, you continue to do your own development and learning. Um, the things that I've shared just to this point have all been things that I've accumulated over a lifetime. And I'm still accumulating and refining and defining and looking at context and all that kind of stuff. So know that this is just the beginning of the journey for you. Or it can be the beginning of the journey for you. And no one is expecting that you have it all or know it all by any particular given point, but that you continue to learn, change, and grow. So, cool. Oh, really? Yeah, it's kind of, yeah, it's this idea that people are too cool to be respectful. Yeah, and when you watch the video, you'll get a different kind of sense of what that means. So, yeah, so I'll make sure that my assistant gets that out to you. Maybe I don't. I thought I did, but okay.
I don't
Can you
even-
just write